Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Allie Gold-Roberts. I'm a co-host for today's live-streamed Climate Week 2020 virtual event, and I'm the Director of State Policy here at Ceres. Welcome to today's session, Charting a Course to 30 by 30 for zero-emission medium and heavy-duty vehicles. I want to thank each of you on the line for joining us in this virtual capacity. A few housekeeping reminders before we dive in. This session is being recorded. We will share a link to the recording and the slides approximately 24 hours after the session. If you have any questions during the session, please submit them in the Q&A chat box. Also, let us know if you have any technical issues, and we're here to help. In addition, if there are any bandwidth issues, there may just be a 30-second pause, and then you'll see us hop back on. Unfortunately, those are a little bit out of our control, but we appreciate your patience. I'd like to just quickly go over the agenda for the morning, and then we'll start with introductions to our work here at Ceres and that of our co-host at CALSTART. We'll start with a presentation from the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Management, also known as NESCOM, about the recent Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, that they organized with 15 states and DC to make 30% of all sales of medium and heavy-duty vehicles zero-emission vehicles by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We'll then dig a bit deeper into what the MOU entails, why the private sector sees this transition as an economic opportunity, what technology and infrastructure is needed to get us there, and how this will benefit our communities and businesses. Finally, we'll talk about what policies and programs are needed to meet the goals of 100% by 2050. We'll hear from the NGO community, vehicle manufacturers, businesses with major commercial fleets, and then directly from utilities, and then 4 of the states in the MOU, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Colorado. This promises to be a robust discussion. And with that, let me tell you a little bit more about Ceres. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit sustainability advocacy organization working with some of the largest and most influential investors and companies in the world to drive solutions throughout the economy and tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time: climate change, water scarcity, pollution, and inequitable workplaces. The Ceres policy team works with a coalition of businesses called BICEP, and I should flex my muscle for you this morning, Businesses for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy. These companies see climate change as a major economic risk and investing in clean technologies as an economic opportunity. We help them bring that message to policymakers federally and across 17 states. Our coalition of almost 70 companies is joined by other businesses that we partner with across the U.S. to help advocate for meaningful policies, including the medium and heavy-duty ZEV MOU. Ceres also leads the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance, or CEVA, a collaborative group of companies focused on accelerating the transition to electric vehicles, from compact cars to Class 8 heavy-duty trucks. Since its launch in January 2020, CEVA has grown to 20 members with significant corporate fleets, including companies with major medium and heavy-duty footprints, such as Amazon, Siemens, Exelon, IKEA, as well as National Grid and DHL, both speaking later this morning. CEVA supports companies with significant fleet operations in the U.S. in making and achieving bold commitments to fleet electrification. We also aggregate corporate demand for EVs to expand the business case for the production of a more diverse array of EV models. And finally, we wanted to highlight why businesses are really supporting this multi-state MOU and see it as vitally important to enable cost-effective electrification of commercial vehicles at the pace and scale needed to meet climate and air quality goals, and of course, to deliver public health and economic benefits. Over the summer, Ceres organized over 36 businesses and investors sending a statement of support to the MOU states, including major fleet operators like Unilever, IKEA, North American Services, PepsiCo, and one of the speakers on our panels, DHL. Companies highlighted the long-term cost savings and benefits that can be captured by decarbonizing commercial vehicles, and we look forward to discussing this further during today's panels. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand the microphone over to Ben Mandel, Northeast Regional Director at CALSTART and today's co-host and co-organizer. Ben, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allie. It's really a pleasure to join Ceres this morning. And I want to thank our attendees for giving us part of their Climate Week. It's really great to be able to have this discussion with all of you today. So I'm really pleased to be able to share a bit about CALSTART's theory of change for global market transformation when it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles transitioning to zero-emission technology through a program we call the Global Commercial Vehicle Drive to Zero program. But before I get into that, just a word of introduction about CALSTART for those not familiar. We're a national clean transportation nonprofit and a consortium of more than 250 members spanning all elements of the clean transportation value chain, all working on advancing implementation for climate and transportation and mobility solutions. So it spans anything from vehicle manufacturers and part suppliers to fuels and infrastructure providers to transit and delivery fleets, utilities, and more. And we're really pleased to be able to feature a few members, Navistar, National Grid, NYCERDA, on this morning's agenda, in addition to great partner organizations joining us as speakers. But today what we're talking about is market transformation in zero-emission technology for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, or what we call commercial vehicles. And much of CALSTART's work in this area is rooted in what we call the beachhead strategy. And basically the foundation of this is that zero-emission technology is best suited to thrive first in the right settings. And those are characterized by short duty cycles, fixed route service, and back to base operation. So transit buses are actually a really good example of where zero-emission technology is likely to thrive first, and we're seeing that in the data. As deployments grow and expand and fleets get more operational experience with those early success or beachhead applications, economies of scale and process familiarity can allow those technology advances to scale and expand into other, maybe more specialized or heavier duty applications successively over years as volumes grow. Such that by just a few years from now, we could be at a place where heavy regional freight, corridor long haul applications will have commercially viable zero-emission technology. So it's not necessarily the case that everything will have a switch flipped and the whole medium and heavy duty ecosystem will be transformed. There's more of a strategy, and it focuses on focusing first on where zero-emission technology can thrive, following this pathways approach. And in fact, we're really seeing this beachhead strategy and that pathway for technological evolution borne out in the data. Through the Drive to Zero program, we are tracking commercial market availability for zero-emission technologies across a range of platforms. At the end of 2019, we had tracked 95 models that were already on the market in the US and Canada and commercially available, and that number is expected nearly to double, to grow by approximately 80% by the end of this year. And that's even after adjusting for the COVID impact on production. That number should have doubled by the end of next year. So what we're seeing is really step function change growth here, and it's spread out across platform types. So at the end of last year, consistent with the beachhead strategy, transit bus was kind of the leading technology type in terms of available models. And we'll start to see that become overtaken this year and next by urban goods movement platforms like medium duty trucks and cargo vans and step vans. And that's what you can see here in the graphic on the right. So the Drive to Zero program, again, is our global strategy for market transformation. And the core pillars of the Drive to Zero pledge, which is memorialized on our website, is for zero emission and near zero emission technologies in those first success or beachhead applications to attain commercial viability and cost competitiveness, at least in global leading regions by 2025. So pretty near term. And then in the longer term, by 2040, to attain sales dominance of at least 80% of new vehicle sales in those leading regions, again, by 2040. These outcomes are memorialized in the Drive to Zero pledge, which is available on the Drive to Zero website, globaldrivetozero.org, which to date has been endorsed by over 80 organizations, elected officials, government agencies, fleets, manufacturers, you name it. We welcome many of you who are interested and have a stake in this market transformation to join us and become a pledge partner. Now, in order to meet these really ambitious objectives, we really need to launch ecosystems where zero-emission technology can thrive, and we can make it easier for fleets to adopt zero-emission technology, not just where there are willing and ambitious fleets, but also where those procurements can be justified on a total cost of ownership basis. So for that reason, we need to make sure that in these ecosystems, we're developing incentives to aid with upfront vehicle costs, making investments in infrastructure to make it easier for those vehicles to be charged at depots or on opportunity charging locations along corridors. We need to look at other types of operating inducements, like perhaps developing zero-emission zones for delivery vehicles in urban centers. And with those steps in place, we can effectively lay a foundation where then we can get to a place of talking about the prospect of adopting regulation, like California has introduced for the Advanced Clean Truck Rule or the Innovative Clean Transit Rule. And of course, those can apply and perhaps should apply both to manufacturers and to fleets to make sure that both sides of the market are in communication. So what we're talking about here today is how a commitment from this summer in the form of a multi-state medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, really sets the stage for there to be more of these ecosystems put in place in more of the US outside of just California. So many of these states now, as Elaine is going to talk about in a moment, have committed to take action and set a strategic plan in place to achieve 30% of medium and heavy duty sales to be zero emission by 2030 and 100% by 2050. We have a long way to go to get there. So the core question for today's program is, how can these states put the right conditions in place to ease zero emission commercial vehicle adoption and get on a trajectory for 30 by 30? With that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Elaine O'Grady, this morning's first guest speaker. Elaine is a Policy and Program Director for the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, or NESCOM, which is coordinating much of this multi-state activity. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Ali, for having me here today, and thank you to your organizations for organizing a great program this morning. I'm really excited to hear the dialogue and different perspectives on the new medium heavy-duty ZEV initiative. And I'm going to start by providing you with a little bit of background on why the MOU was developed. I'll summarize the key provisions of the MOU, and then I'll talk a bit about next steps and the timeline for those steps. Let me see if I can figure out the slides. Here we go. So NESCOM, if you're not familiar with NESCOM, we are the Regional Association of State Air Quality Agencies in the Northeast. We cover the 6 New England states and New York and New Jersey. You can see them on the map here. We provide scientific, technical, analytical, and policy support to our state's air quality and climate programs. And we have a very long history of working with California and our states on adopting California's motor vehicle emission standards for light-duty vehicles. In fact, 7 of our 8 states have adopted California's Advanced Clean Cars program in lieu of the federal standards. In 2013, NESCOM spearheaded the signing of a multi-state ZEV MOU for passenger vehicles, and it committed the states to work together to develop policies and programs that would advance the market for light-duty vehicles. And to help the MOU states move from commitment to action, NESCOM convened the multi-state task force and then worked with the task force to develop 2 action plans released in 2014 and 2018, and also helped to ensure steady progress on implementing those plans. The idea for the multi-state medium and heavy-duty ZEV MOU was simply born from the recognition that we needed a similar effort to advance the market for zero-emission trucks and buses. All right, so it is Climate Week, so we have to talk about greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was one of the driving factors behind this initiative. As you can see on the graph on the left, it looks like a donut. Transportation accounts for 42% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the Northeast, with light-duty vehicles comprising about half of those emissions, and medium and heavy-duty vehicles comprising around a quarter of those emissions. Although light-duty vehicles are the largest source of transportation sector greenhouse gas emissions, you can see on the graph on the right here that medium and heavy-duty vehicles are the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in the Northeast. And this isn't really that surprising when you think about the growth in e-commerce that we've seen over the past decade. And the number of truck miles traveled on our nation's highways is expected to grow significantly in the coming decades. Another driving factor behind the MOU is that truck and bus electrification promises to deliver widespread health benefits, especially to low-income communities and communities of color that are located near freight corridors, ports, and trucking distribution centers, and disproportionately impacted by diesel emissions. Diesel emissions from heavy-duty trucks and buses are a major source of smog-forming pollution, particulate matter, and air toxics. And by way of example here, you can see that on-road heavy-duty diesel is the second largest source of NOx emissions in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region. And this is really quite, when you look at the contribution here, it's really quite remarkable when you take into consideration that these vehicles only make up less than 5% of the vehicles on the road. So the bottom line is that electrifying trucks will provide improved health benefits, particularly in our most vulnerable communities that are, burdened with high levels of air pollution as a result of heavy truck traffic. So let's get into the MOU a little bit here. As I mentioned before, the MOU for medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles really builds off the success of the 2013 MOU for light duty ZEVs. NESCOM announced the MOU this summer on July 14th, and the real objective is to accelerate the electrification of trucks and buses. It commits the signatory jurisdictions to work together to foster a self-sustaining market for zero-emission trucks and buses. And as been mentioned, it calls for 30% of new truck and bus sales to be zero-emission by 2030 and 100% by 2050. The MOU also prioritizes the need to accelerate the deployment of zero-emission trucks and buses in disadvantaged communities that have historically been burdened with higher levels of pollution. And finally, the action plan directs the states to work through the ZEV task force to develop and implement a multi-state medium and heavy-duty ZEV action plan. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, so here on this map, you can see the jurisdictions that have signed on to the MOU. They're shown in green. As you can see, we have pretty good geographic distribution. We've got 3 West Coast states, several Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, North Carolina in the Southeast, Colorado in the middle of the country, and Hawaii as well. If your state's not in green and you want it to be, it's not too late to sign on. Give me a call. We're also want to point out that the 15 signatory states in Washington, D.C. account for almost 50% of the U.S. economy and nearly 40% of the goods moved by truck. And I think I saw Patricio Portillo from NRDC in the audience. I want to give him credit for pulling those statistics together and sharing them with NESCOM. So in terms of next steps, right now, immediately following the release of the action plan in July, NESCOM and the signatory jurisdictions began conducting an initial round of kind of introductory meetings with key stakeholders. The real purpose of these initial meetings is to explain the initiative, much like I'm doing here today, and provide an opportunity for stakeholders to offer early input on the action plan. You can see some of the groups that we're reaching out to are listed here. During these initial meetings, we're asking for folks to basically identify any issues of interest or concern, if they have any recommendations for action plan strategies. We're also looking for any studies, data, experts, pilot programs, anything else that the signatory jurisdiction should really take into consideration as they are developing the action plan. Okay, and then another big next step is the actual development of the draft action plan. As I mentioned, the MOU directs the states to work through the ZEV task force, which NESCOM facilitates, to develop an action plan that considers the need for a number of market enabling actions, such as incentives for vehicles and infrastructure, adoption of regulatory standards, such as California's Advanced Clean Trucks regulations, utility actions to support infrastructure build-out and beneficial rate design, measures to increase the use of zero-emission trucks and delivery vans in densely populated areas, innovative financing models and new funding sources, actions to encourage fleet purchases, and uniform standards and data collection requirements. To inform the development and drafting of the action plan, NESCOM is planning to hold a series of informational webinars for the signatory states The webinars will provide an opportunity for state staff to hear from a variety of experts on key challenges, issues, and solutions to electrifying the medium and heavy duty sector. And it'll also provide a forum and opportunity for state staff to have really candid discussions about the key barriers to electrifying the sector and ways to address them. All right, so finally, I want to provide kind of our tentative timeline, and I want to give a big caveat here that this is subject to change. If you look on the left here, we are at the very, very beginning of this process. As I mentioned, we are currently conducting stakeholder outreach. During the last quarter of this year, we will hold the informational webinars for the signatory states and start drafting the action plan. The goal is to have a draft action plan recommendations ready during the first quarter of 2021. And then to solicit input on the draft plan, we'll conduct another round of stakeholder outreach at that point. During the second quarter of 2021, the ZEV Task Force and NESCOM will work together to revise the plan based on comments and feedback we've received from stakeholders. And we'll start the process of getting state approvals on the final action plan. And then finally, we're aiming to release, publish, finalize, and do all that and release the action plan next summer in 2021. So as you can see, we are really at the very beginning of this process, and we have a lot of hard but important work ahead of us. Meetings like this are such a vital part of the process because it provides us with an opportunity to exchange information and learn from one another. So with that, I'd like to conclude with a sincere thank you to Ceres and CALSTART for organizing this event and for all the participants who I look forward to hearing from today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Elaine. And Elaine, since you've got us a little bit ahead of time, I'm going to address one quick question to you that just came in on the chat from Jesse Lund, who asks, what are some lessons learned from the light-duty ZEV side that you anticipate will be relevant here with respect to medium and heavy-duty vehicles?
Okay, some less. Well, I think we are starting at a point where we know a lot more than we did when we started with the light-duty MOU in 2013. We've learned a lot about the challenges associated with funding, for instance, for incentives. We've learned about the importance of utility investments in charging infrastructure. And I think we've built a lot of relationships that are going to help us with this effort too, with the various stakeholder groups that I had mentioned on a slide, ranging from utilities to manufacturers to NGOs and so forth. We've learned that it really, this is a group effort, even though it's a MOU signed by the states. We're going to need everyone's help on this. And we I think, recognize that fully, and that's a key lesson learned.
Well, thanks so much, Elaine, and thank you for sharing the great work NESCOM is doing to guide and shepherd the process along, solicit stakeholder input into the action plan development, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, dialogues like these can continue to be fruitful. So now, for our first panel of the day, I'm thrilled to welcome in three excellent discussants to share kind of reactions to what Elaine has just shared from a variety of perspectives. We've got industry perspectives, both from the manufacturer point of view, as well as that of a leading logistics and delivery fleet. And we've got the community organizing and advocacy perspective represented as well. So we'll have each of them kind of give an opening statement of sorts in response to what Elaine has shared, and then we'll open it up a little bit to more of a facilitated discussion. First up, we'll go to Jason Gies, who is the Director of Business Development for e-mobility at Navistar. Jason, as a traditional truck manufacturer, can you talk a bit about how Navistar is managing the transition towards zero-emission technology and what this mobilization of so much of the national market does to hasten that transition?
Yeah, sure, Ben. First, I want to say thank you to both Ben, Allie, and the rest of the folks that have been on this call today. We count it an honor to be with this team and having this discussion. So from the Navistar perspective, we are an old company. Our roots go back into the 1830s when Cyrus McCormick invented the mechanical reaper. International was born in the early 1900s. We've been producing trucks for quite some time. So this is a huge shift from our perspective. We are excited for the future, though. This is a fun time to be part of the Navistar team. So some of the areas we've been focusing on, though, is we've brought on a full e-mobility team. We announced it recently that we have our next business unit here based in Rochester Hills, Michigan, that will be focusing on electrifying both our school bus platforms and our truck platforms. We've also announced that we are joining our other competition and our other partner companies such as Traton, the MAN Group and Scania Group is a member in Charin. So we are excited to be helping tackle this charging standard and charging implementation issue in the coming years. The third area we're excited about is helping our customers out with putting charging into their facilities and into our dealer facilities. Recently, we signed a master service agreement with a partner company called In Charge. They are helping us, again, put the charging solutions in, site planning for our customers' locations, and helping us getting over those initial hurdles of electric vehicle implementation. The other exciting thing we've heard in the last couple of weeks, and there's been a lot of press on this, our CEO announced during our earnings call 2 weeks ago that the first vehicle that Navistar will be producing in San Antonio, a new plant that is opening in early 2022, will be electrified. It'll be fully built and manufactured down our brand new line there. So this is a company on the change. We feel that diesel will be around. We have a lot of folks focused on clean diesel technologies, but as those technologies and as Ben mentioned earlier with this beachhead strategy, we want to be able to focus on filling those gaps and growing with our customers and making sure that we can put either electrified technology or clean diesel technology in, but really transitioning to a zero emissions is a main focus of Navistar going forward. The other area we've been focusing on is helping our customers with this transition. Navistar traditionally has sold trucks again for many years. This is a tough change for many folks. So we've put the pieces in place to help with that transition from beginning to end. So we're helping them again with our charging infrastructure, consulting on route profiles, going back to Ben's beachhead strategy, and also we are working with connectivity to make sure that the vehicles are connected and we're getting feedback and our customers are comfortable with these vehicles as they implement them. And then really our last piece of that approach is conserving. And we are excited for some of the things we're doing on the battery side of the business. We have plans in place for anything from battery reuse on vehicles to stationary power to battery recycling programs at the end of the life of batteries. So we're looking at that before we even introduce our first vehicles. And my closing this out, we did announce last week or in the last week and a half that we are putting school buses into British Columbia, Canada. We are now going into full production late this year, and we will be adding other locations throughout Canada and the United States in the coming months. So we are growing, we are changing as a company, and it's an exciting time to be part of the Navistar team. So again, thank you, Ben. Thank you, CALSTART. Thank you, Ceres, and we're excited for some of the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. Really great to hear about the Navistar family of brands and how that evolution is taking place in real time. Really appreciate it. over to Lauren Bailey, who is the Director of Climate Policy for Tri-State Transportation Campaign. And Lauren, as from an advocacy group perspective, I'm hoping you can talk a bit about kind of the public health imperative of rapid market transformation for buses and trucks in New York, but also in other urban areas in MOU states.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you to CALSTART and Ceres for having me here today. As Ben said, I am Tri-State Transportation Campaign's Director of Climate Policy, which means that I get to focus on one of our four guiding principles. We work in many different transportation areas, working to make transportation fair, fixing our commutes, stopping pedestrian deaths, but I get to focus on meeting our climate goals, which is a huge imperative across the transportation and environmental advocacy spheres right now. So it's nice to hear everyone's kind of saying the same things we've been saying for a bit longer. I think the main headline really is that this is an emergency. We are in a climate emergency as well as a public health emergency, and that was before a pandemic sent us all home. And I think that we don't often think of diesel emissions in particular as something that is a community health issue. I think there's a lot of research that has happened over the decades, particularly about the occupational hazards, for example, as well as the environmental hazards, but we haven't really honed in on what the public health hazards are. Before I go any further, I just want to say a lot of the information that I want to share comes from the most recent American Lung Association report that came out, I believe, just last week or the week before. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend everyone reads it, in particular if you need more context on the case for vehicle electrification from a public health perspective. But to highlight some of the big public health realizations, particularly in 2020, we know already that diesel causes these community health issues. We know that we see higher rates of asthma. We see people suffering from more severe allergy symptoms if they are exposed to diesel exhaust, and not to even delve into the massive particulate matter or PM 2.5 concerns that we see with the actual soot or black carbon, whatever you would like to call it, coming off of, in particular, older vehicles. So while we have seen a lot of these newer vehicles, anti-idling conversations, things like that, improve air quality in specific communities, we still need to just really move right to electrification. A lot of these are improving things, but we are not eliminating these massive sources of pollution for these communities. And really what it comes down to is that this is not an issue that affects us all equally. While we are at the point, particularly in our country with our highway system and the way we move goods around, we are not experiencing this harm equally. We are overburdened in underserved communities. Some states use different definitions. Maybe in your state it's a disadvantaged community is the definition. Environmental justice communities is the term we use in New York. Distressed communities is another term that I think frankly says it best. They are the ones that are living near our sources. When we talk about mobile sources, we think trucks move around. And so it's a disparate concern. However, we know now that people who live near highways, even with anti-idling or, rapid moving transportation, we are still seeing these massive health concerns. People that live near ports, as well as transportation transfer stations where there are vehicles idling, but also moving around a lot. And there are a lot of people that we now know that live near transit bus terminals and in general, transit hubs that are also seeing this. So while we want transit everywhere, we want electric transit everywhere because this is another source that is coming into our neighborhoods. And while we have seen in 2020, a lot of driving is not happening. Many of us are, under stay-at-home orders or are voluntarily working from home. If you went to a port in the peak of shutdown on the East Coast, it's still going. Delivery did not slow at the same rate that everything else did. And we are now seeing that we are almost up at the same rates as pre-COVID for these trucks. So not only are the people that are moving our goods, picking our food, our healthcare heroes already at risk of these emissions in a lot of areas, they are also having to be at risk of being exposed to coronavirus to keep us all home and safe. So I hope I'm making it as clear as possible that this is not, I don't want to use academic language that this is directly linked or this is a comorbidity, because this is a 1-2 punch to people that already are keeping us moving and keeping us safe. So I'll leave it there because I'm looking forward to the conversation. But I think that when we talk about 2030, it feels so far away, especially knowing that 2020 has been so long. 2050 seems almost unimaginable, but it's going to be here before we know it. And I really am happy to see our business partners, our freight and logistics partners, manufacturers having these logistical conversations. So thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That was great. That really kind of hammers home the community perspective, the story about exposures, and the kind of double whammy you speak to as well is especially pressing right now. So now we go from kind of the community perspective to someone who can speak to the vehicles driving in those communities and what DHL is working on specifically to reduce those exposures. So Bruce Marsh is the Director of Corporate Public Policy for Deutsche Post DHL Americas, and we're thrilled to have Bruce join us today. Bruce, can you tell us a bit about DHL's electrification goals and how a policy opportunity this large kind of gives a signal to a fleet such as yours of where to prioritize its cutting-edge technology?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ben, for the invitation today, and thanks to CALSTART and to Ceres and Ali for letting me come and talk a little bit about kind of our strategy and the future and excitement around the new MOU. So I'll just start by saying I regularly talk to my counterparts in Brussels about what's going on stateside. They like to share what's going on in EU and various initiatives. And I'll say, at least from a federal level, my reporting has been a little lean recently in recent years. A lot going on at the state level, obviously TCI and obviously this MOU now. But really excited. I was really excited to share the news when it was signed and put out there in the press. So I will say that DHL, the Deutsche Post DHL group, in the US we call ourselves DHL. We have 4 divisions, and we were one of the first, I think the first delivery company back in March of 2017 of the major delivery companies to make a pledge to go net zero by 2050. And so since then we've really focused on 2 goals. One is improving carbon efficiency by 50% by 2025, and then making sure that our pickup and delivery, our what we call our PUD vehicles, that 70% of those deliveries and pickups are made by clean methods. So that's either by EV or by cargo bike. We have some 27,000 bike routes, half of them being e-bikes globally. So those 2 goals we're working towards. I will say right now we're doing kind of an introspection and looking at aviation. Obviously for us is the largest source of emissions. It's a massive source of emissions for us, the majority, but our surface network makes up about 21% of our total emissions globally. And that's also, parallels here in the US. And out of that, we have a global fleet of about a little over 100,000 vehicles, about 17% of those being medium and heavy duty vehicles, and about 8,000 vehicles in the US. Again, about a quarter of those being medium and heavy duty vehicles. So just to give you context, we're a large operator. I think we benefit from our global operations and that we can learn. We work in some really difficult markets. But I'll say that, you mentioned, and I think you really hit it on the head, Ben, when you talked about in your introduction about the waves. And I think we've really been focused on those waves 1 and 2. We have more than 11,000 EVs, pickup and delivery EVs in our network already, most of those in Europe. But we understand, we know how to get there. We feel like we've been learning a lot in that area. And that's moving. We know what we need to do. We know that capital investments need to be made. We know that OEMs are coming online. But what's more complicated is in this medium and heavy duty sector. And I think we've been focusing on the carbon efficiency aspects of our current fleet. So that means experimenting with biofuels, looking at improving trailer designs, And we've actually just a company that came out of one of our incubator cohorts a few years ago. It's called Trailar. It's a very cool solar mat that goes on the top of our trailers, and it provides about 5% of the truck's energy needs. So it can, lift and lower gates. It can provide other onboard types of power that's needed. And so those are really, we're making headway there, but not enough. I think, we continue to improve our current fleet, but we realize that what we need now is to take that next step into those next waves. And that's where this MOU really comes in. And I think, the collaboration, I think I like to call it the four corners of collaboration between government and regulators, between the utilities, between the OEMs like Navistar, and the fleet operators. I mean, we really have to work together now and collaborate. And I think the governments and the regulators have that really critical role of working with stakeholders, and that ecosystem that you talked about. I mean, it's really, really important. And they have the lead in terms of creating the strategy, in terms of developing, those incentive packages. And the utilities then have, the role to ensure capacity to operators, and appropriate charging infrastructure. And I think with OEMs too, I mean, it's great. Great to hear about Navistar. I think this is what it needs. What the MOU was needed. I think OEMs want to hear it. I think we're working very closely with the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance to approach OEMs in terms of showing them that there's a market demand now, and a growing market demand, and that's only going to increase. So I think all positive signs, and I think governments really are the catalysts in this, and the enablers of this ecosystem that we've talked about.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bruce. Now we want to get you all started on a bit of discussion. We'll bring Elaine back into the conversation as well. And bearing in mind that this session is titled "Setting the Stakes," I want to talk about something that Lauren began to hit on, which is COVID impacts. Obviously, that's being felt economy-wide. It's being felt by communities. And yet, at this point in time is when we are beginning to really see an inflection point for market transformation with medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So can a few of you or all of you talk about the impact you're seeing related to COVID and why it's especially important to be setting big targets now?
Sure, maybe I can start. I think our industry is seeing the impact probably as much or more than anyone else. I mean, it's Elaine, you alluded in your graph to the growth in those delivery vehicles, and I think that's one aspect is just with e-commerce shifting from we've traditionally been, at least our Express division has been a B2B, a business to business type of a company, and with the pandemic and with e-commerce growth, we've seen an incredible shift from that B2B business to B2C, and home deliveries, which are a much more expensive endeavor for delivery companies. And where documents are small, easy to carry, you can fit a lot on a vehicle. You can't necessarily do that with with these types of e-commerce shipments, and so that and getting those goods to our depots, to our service centers from our airport gateways, from our hubs, requires heavy duty trucks. And so we're seeing growth just across the board, and it's and really in our Express division, 40% sustained growth. I mean, that's what we see generally in a holiday period, in a October, November, December period, but we've seen that now consistently since May, and it's not stopping. I mean, we're preparing for the peak to continue, on into next year. And people have gotten used to doing it. All of you, probably myself, have gotten used to doing a lot of your shopping online. And that has been a positive development for our bottom line, but it's also creating real challenges for us as a company in terms of meeting our sustainability goals. And I talked about kind of that introspection right now, that focus internally. We've taken our sustainability team and kind of broken them up into two parts. We have our Go Green kind of communications team that does a lot of the comm side of things, but we also have what we call our Clean Ops team, and they're now embedded in all four of our divisions. working very closely to figure out what it's going to take to keep our, reducing in that trajectory downward. And so it's a really, really challenging time for us. And I think the MOU couldn't have come at a better time. I think we're looking at states that have established programs, a lot of the states that are signatories of the MOU. And it's really, I think this is going to be the impetus for us to really make some big moves at this point in time.
From a public health impact perspective, I think Lauren touched on this. I mean, there's a very recent Harvard University study that links long-term exposure of fine particulate matter to increase morbidity from COVID. And so that's, a huge factor that really didn't play into the decision to do the MOU at all. But I think it just adds urgency to the need to electrify the sector and reduce particulate matter emissions from medium and heavy duty trucks and buses.
Thanks for hitting on that, Elaine. You took the words right out of my mouth. But I think that I would add on to that a couple perspectives, particularly from the transit perspective of what we've seen during COVID, which is that while train traffic is significantly down, subway traffic in New York City, commuter traffic between New Jersey and New York, for example, on some of the busiest trains in the country have essentially dried up. Buses, which move many workers who are transit dependent instead of transit optional, this way, a lot of folks coin it, they're still full and these buses are still running and they're still needed. And I think that knowing that buses are the workhorse of pretty much every transit authority, regardless of whether they have trains, light rail, or other options. Buses really are what gets us around, and COVID has proven that yet again, that this is a technology that we really need, and to electrify that industry is going to be really imperative. The other thing I wanted to go back to is something Elaine mentioned, actually, which is the 50% of the economy number for the MOU states, as well as 40% of goods moved by truck. I'm not an economist, but I'm pretty sure if you look at that, you're going to see the sea change that we need. So I think that knowing that Bruce, for example, seeing this as his impetus to push things and get energized, seeing that signal to our industries at a time when we can't even begin to dream of economic stimulus to get out of the holes that all of our industries are in. I think to see this as policy levers that we know we have that have been identified and successful in other opportunities, I think this is going to be a really important time to move this forward, knowing that we are all very focused on how we get around safely, how we get around efficiently, and what that's going to look like in the future.
Yeah, so from our perspective, and to build off of what Lauren said, we are the largest school bus manufacturer in the country right now, and we're monitoring that situation very closely because kids aren't going to school, frankly. So our sales have been slightly down, but it's been fairly flat. So I think schools are waiting at this point and watching, but it's a potential threat for us. But again, it's a very market segment issue at this point when you're looking at it. The goods market, per what Bruce said, has been great. So we've been supplying a lot of vehicles in that space. So COVID hasn't really affected us there. Construction actually has been very strong for us. But there's some other areas that we're seeing, such as a lot of the small businesses that had our onesie twosie customers are not buying right now because they're just uncomfortable and they're monitoring the situation extremely close because their businesses, some of them have even been decimated, which is a terrible thing. So the other thing COVID has allowed Navistar to do is I feel take a step back and really focus. And we are between the ACT and many of the other things that are coming down the pike, we have been excited to take a step back and look at electrification. You've seen this company, and I can tell you from the internal perspective, change in the last 12 to 18 months and drive in the right direction. So we're excited to go there. We're excited with the products that we'll be starting to display in the next few months and really change from the inside out.
So I'd like to integrate maybe one of the questions that's come in over chat, which gets at, the higher incremental cost of this technology, which is somewhat of an elephant in the room, but I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. So Samuel McLaughlin asks, he assumes the cost of electric vehicles and charging during this early stage of market development is quite high. But how can private customers take on this investment knowing the cost may be significantly, he estimates, 2 to 4 times higher than current liquid fuel trucks? I think the way I'd like to maybe spin this to beyond just Jason is, what kind of market barriers are you seeing to rapid electrification of buses and trucks? And what is maybe a targeted investment, incentive, or other policy and action that you would advise be considered for inclusion in the action plan?
Yeah, well, I'll start with this and I'll let everybody else jump in. So this is the question I get every day, and we spent hours upon hours upon hours discussing this. So really the simple answer is scale, right? We can get costs down with scale, and we're not going to get scale with onesie, twosie deployments throughout the country, right? Those are great. Don't get me wrong. It'll get folks into electric vehicles or into zero-emission vehicles. But having real programs where we can put a substantial amount of vehicles into places, including the charging as the same bundle, is extremely important. Customers don't want to take that burden on out of the get-go. And I don't care how large they are. And some folks have really aggressive climate goals, but when you sit down and have a discussion with them, they need that holistic approach and they want to see larger deployments. That'll also help us de-risk it with putting the right resources in place to help the customers be successful.
Yeah, I would add in terms of I think we're we're challenged right now. It's obviously it is high cost. We're trying to figure out our kind of our capital expenditure trajectory over the coming years, and I think for us the most powerful incentive to go with electric, despite the cost, is really having it's not just the public health benefit is obviously critical to us. We operate in every urban area worldwide, and I think we're experiencing all sorts of barriers already. Look at Mexico City, Madrid, Paris, diesel bans. Granted, those are older vehicles, but it's coming, and not sure when it will come to the States, but it's something that we're already grappling with as a company. And so, I think having, and Ben, you mentioned it in your slides, it's the most powerful way for us to begin the transition in the MHDV segment is really infrastructure investments that match vehicle incentives. And I think to have those two together, I'll give you an example. Right now, we're electrifying our East Los Angeles service center. We've bought several electric trucks to provide the service back and forth to our LAX gateway to East Los Angeles. And we're electrifying. We took advantage of the HVIP incentives, those point of sale vouchers, which are, from my fleet folks' perspective, work very well. And we're working with the utility there in East Los Angeles now to install the fast chargers, the DCFCs, at that facility. And together, it makes a really powerful argument for why we should be electrifying, and even going beyond, the LNG. You talk about the natural gas as an option. It is. I think we've seen competitors that really think that's the interim step, and I don't think we played with that. We've piloted, but I don't think we're convinced.
Yeah, I would add on that to get a little bit more nitty gritty. Bruce mentioned, that they're working with a lot of the utilities directly. And I think that one of the hardest things in quantifying how much an electric vehicle transition is actually going to mean for a lot of these companies, and in particular for, a lot of the smaller companies that are not going to be building their own massive service centers and charging areas for their vehicles, but have really benefited from on-road fuels being portable and being easily accessible, is going to be utility and state level actions to make it easier to charge these vehicles. So scale for infrastructure, not just for purchasing, I think is going to be a massive component of this. And I know that there are a lot of great minds at work about interoperability, for example, between the different OEMs for a lot of the charging infrastructure. But I think that we are currently in a bit of a cell phone in the early 2000s fight with everybody has their own technology. And while, industries traditionally do end up in the same place, being able to accelerate that in whatever ways make the most sense for logistics. And also just finding places that this does work, so we're able to replicate it. And also, I do think that the waves are the best option, being able to use transit as the first wave. I noticed there was a question in the chat about still electrifying transit. Transit's always the starting point for a lot of these pilots. It's kind of where these things are able to get their start, and then they end up in the private sector because of the initial work that the transit authorities and a lot of states and local governments do. So I think that seeing some of these pilots pop up, the more success stories we have, but at the end of the day, if we're not able to have the utility buy-in, cut red tape, and have accelerated interoperability, scaling isn't going to be particularly feasible. So I think those are some of the big things that I would focus on, and I'll be definitely looking for as the MOU conversations and the action plan conversations go forward.
I think it's also really interesting to consider the role of transit still as the first wave, although the question that came up is a very good one about, transit budgets being squeezed and can we still ask for that expenditure? But when you look at the Federal Transit Administration and the Low-No program and other grant programs they make available for the purchase of zero-emission buses, a lot of states are really allocating initial waves of their Volkswagen settlement dollars to public transit above all else, in some cases entirely to transit. We're starting to see, the public sector really support getting us onto this trajectory by seeding those investments in the technological evolution with transit. So it's a really interesting story to track. I want to thank our first panel, Elaine and Bruce and Lauren and Jason. You all have been terrific. And you've actually helped do our job really nicely because you touched on a lot of the themes we're going to hear about in the back half of our agenda. This morning, we're going to hear from a leading utility operating in 3 of the MOU states, National Grid, on the status of infrastructure preparedness. And then we're going to hear from states who are looking into these solutions, deploying them in real time in some cases, and trying to get a sense of the outlook going forward as they seek to get to 30 by 30. So we recognize that Climate Week is dense. People have Zoom fatigue to begin with. We want to encourage you to stay logged on. Don't go anywhere, but to take a 5-minute break, use the facilities, stretch your leg, and then we'll be back at it at 10:05 promptly with a presentation from National Grid. Thanks, everyone. Stay tight.
Okay, excellent. Well, we are at 10:05, and in the interest of honoring people's time, we're going to dive right in, and I am deeply honored and thrilled to welcome everyone back, and hope you all had a chance to stretch your legs, but also I'm excited to kick off the second half of our morning with a short presentation from Rachel Flynn Kasuba, the Manager of Clean Transportation Programs, Commercial and Fleet at National Grid. As was noted earlier, National Grid is a rock star company. They are a member of CALSTART and the Ceres Company Network and the Corporate EV Alliance, the perfect trifecta. And I can't think of a more fitting speaker to talk about the infrastructure needed to prepare for this important transition. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have you give us a short presentation, and then we'll, at 10:15, pull in representatives from 4 states to really dive into more specifics. So take it away, Rachel.
Great. Thank you. So I will start just by saying thank you to the morning panelists who all addressed the role of the utility, sometimes good, sometimes a hold up. And if there's one thing I want folks to take away from this, it's that while the utility can sometimes get a bad reputation for holding things up, there are many of us, increasingly more and more utilities now, that are really focused on medium and heavy duty fleet electrification and preparing for that, and working very closely with customers and with a keen interest in working even more closely with customers to make sure that we can help prepare for the infrastructure that's needed in order to really roll these out at scale. So if you wouldn't mind skipping to the next slide. Before I dig into some of the specific national grid programs and the way that we're thinking about this, I want to just take a moment to sort of touch on why we care so much about fleet electrification. And as Lauren and Elaine had mentioned earlier, first and foremost is the role that medium heavy duty vehicles play in transportation emissions and equity and underlying health impacts. So that's a really key driving force, and we're thrilled to see all of our states join the ZEB MOU. The other piece of this, of course, is the capacity issues, and less so the overall capacity increase or load increase that we expect to see from fleet electrification, but more the concentrated load at specific depots, and the fact that even a less than 100% fleet conversion can be 2, 5, 10 plus megawatts per customer site, and that has a key impact on our planning and our forecasting. And so we really want to make sure that we're getting as much visibility as possible ahead of time into where that's going to come on, and so that our engineers can plan accordingly. Thanks. And then, certainly from a customer perspective, we've had a lot of conversations and done some, research with CalSTART's assistants on kind of the key customer challenges, which I'm sure are very familiar to all of you. Upfront is the just planning process, where to get started, how to think about the site analysis, the bill impact, the technology and vehicle options, and then how much it'll actually cost, especially from an infrastructure upgrade perspective. And then lastly, as Ben kind of mentioned at the end of the last panel, the vehicle availability and the high upfront cost of the vehicles. So some of those, we see the utility playing a key role in, mostly 1 and 2. The third one is something that we're actively working with other partners on. Thanks. So getting in a little bit more to the national grid programs, we're really thinking about this in 3 or 4 different key ways. First and foremost is fleet studies. So that's addressing the customer pain point around planning, right? Where do customers start? How do they go from understanding the current vehicle list to what electric vehicle options are available? And then beyond that, what does it actually mean for their existing site, the depot that they currently use versus what other options are available, the potential, rate options and bill impact, and really looking at what the end-to-end planning process looks like. Many of our larger sophisticated customers have their own outside entities and consultants that can help them with this. But we want to make sure that from a utility perspective, we're also being available to help, especially on the site impact, site analysis and bill impact aspect of it. As well as for our smaller and medium-sized customers who maybe don't have the resources to go out and hire an outside party to be able to provide that offering for them. So we've started in Rhode Island. We've completed 9 of 12 studies already. These were more on the pilot size, diverse range of customers to get a sense of really, what the status is, what the challenges are, what some key lessons learned are. We've recently scaled that to Massachusetts and are offering 100 comprehensive end-to-end studies for customers that are mostly government and public, with a real focus on LMI and environmental justice communities. And then in New York, we are in the process of offering and standing up a site and bill impact analysis for all fleet customers that are interested. So we're really excited about that one because that'll be the first offering at scale for these fleet studies. It won't go the full end-to-end just yet, but we'll start with these 2 key pieces of it and make that available for all interested customers. And then, following closely on the heels of the actual study portion of this is how do we help customers address the infrastructure needs and the cost of those upgrades. So we have charging station make-ready programs in Massachusetts and Rhode Island currently. There are, specific focus areas we have for both of those programs. And then in New York, thanks to the recent New York EV order, we're going to increase the size of that program a bit, although not at full scale quite yet, for medium and heavy duty vehicles across our territory in upstate New York. And really hope, help customers focus on the charging infrastructure upgrades and try to reduce some of that upfront cost for them. A couple other challenges here that I'll just mention briefly. The vehicle purchase and the upfront cost is something that we don't necessarily see a utility role in, too strongly, but that we want to make sure we're making the resources available for our customers and that the state resources, are there to help them out. So the New York TVIP program, Truck Voucher Incentive Program, has been really helpful, and similar related programs in Rhode Island and Massachusetts that we point customers to. Last thing I'll mention here is on the bottom, just resources, something we're really excited about and that we'll be launching hopefully in the next couple of weeks is a microsite for fleet customers. So this will be a one-stop shop on National Grid's website that will host all the information about our fleet-related programs, some other links to state programs, some tools, some other resources that will hopefully give our customers a much more streamlined experience or thinking about how they go through this process and how they work with the utility. Thanks. So finally, and just real quickly so we can save a minute or two for questions, as we think about lessons learned and going forward, we've tried to spend a lot of time connecting with our solar and storage and DG groups to gain some lessons learned from the experiences they went through as they kind of went from an emerging technology to broader scale and, hopefully being a little bit more strategic in the way that we're planning for vehicle electrification. And as I said, especially medium heavy duty electrification, where we'll have concentrated loads at certain customer sites. An interesting thing on the data side that we didn't think about up front was that many of our fleet customers don't necessarily have the kind of granular data on their fleet usage that we were initially expecting. And so we spent a lot of time coming up with baseline assumptions and some standard inputs that have really helped us kind of streamline the process as we're making recommendations to customers. And then also making sure that in these conversations, we're not just talking about the immediate infrastructure need that the customers suggest and think they want around, number of charging stations or total load, but really understanding what their short, medium, and long-term goals are, so we can help them understand if managed charging options can, get them to the same place but bring down some of their costs, or if, another depot that they might have that they hadn't thought about electrifying would actually be significantly cheaper in terms of capacity, availability, and just kind of getting a better sense of what their end goal is and helping them work backwards to the most cost-effective solution. And then lastly here, just another plug on the, if there's one recommendation I would leave folks with and kind of ask for is, again, to engage the utility early and often, because we are thinking about this topic. We spend a lot of time talking to our customers, talking to our internal engineers and other relevant groups to make sure that we can be as prepared as possible when this conversion happens and actually get ahead of it so that we can help to avoid some of the timing frustrations that we've seen elsewhere and that we want to make sure that we're not the bottleneck for. And I think with that, I'm almost up at time. So the next slide is just open questions and contact. Absolutely. If anyone's interested in more details or follow-up discussions, I'd be happy to chat more.
Thanks, Rachel. And I realize we're right at time. There was one comment or question, in the chat. So if you have a moment and want to reply to it, go for it. And in the interest of time, though, and it looks like another question just popped in as well. And if not, folks should feel free to get in touch with Rachel But I'm going to kick off our next panel, and I know my colleague Han is going to bring up everybody. We're excited, and I should say also a big thank you to you, Rachel, and National Grid for the important work that you all are doing. I want to introduce our next panel, which includes Victoria Carey, the Senior Project Officer at the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, Daniel Gotti, the Director of Clean Transportation Policy at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Kay Kelly, the Transportation and Climate Change Specialist at the Colorado Energy Office, and Adam Reuter, the Assistant Director for Clean Transportation at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I always use acronyms, so having to actually say out all of your agency names, I feel like I'm ready for lunch. We are really excited to have these 4 states join us, and I wish we could pull back up Elaine's map, and maybe we will actually, to show how you all are actually, I'll do that. You all are MOU signers, and we tried to get a little bit of geographic representation. So thank you, especially to Kay, for helping hold up the West for us with Colorado. But we're excited to ask each of you about the work that your states are doing, obviously, in particular about the MOU and how you see your state's ability to achieve 30% by 2030, but also all of the complementary programs and policies that will be needed to help get us there and meet your own state's ambitious climate goals. So with that, we're going to start with kind of an opening question. Can each of you tell us a little bit about your state's commitment to reduce emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles and some of the programs you have in place or are considering? I know some of you are about to launch some new programs to decarbonize this important sector of emissions. And we'll start with Adam and New York, and we'll try and keep these short for about 5 minutes at the most, and then we'll dive into some discussion. So Adam, take it away.
Great, thanks, Allie, and thanks to everyone for joining today. New York State and Governor Cuomo have been leaders in reducing emissions from not just the transportation sector, but economy-wide. Last year in 2019, New York State passed and Governor Cuomo signed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which requires nation-leading emissions reductions 85% by 2050 and carbon neutral economy by 2050, with some intermediate goals as well. And we see medium and heavy duty trucks as an integral part of achieving that goal. For 2 reasons. Number one, because they make up about a quarter of the transportation sector emissions, and transportation makes up about 35% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. And we cannot achieve those goals without reducing emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles, even if we got the entire rest of the economy to zero. But also another key element of the CLCPA was the investment in disadvantaged communities. And we know that medium and heavy duty vehicles are a major driver of pollution in disadvantaged communities. They have been and they continue to be. And we really want to make sure that we are taking key steps to alleviate that pollution and make improvements in these disadvantaged communities. And investing in medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification is a great way to do that. So what we're doing now, we already have a program set up called the New York Truck Voucher Incentive Program, similar to the HVIP program in California. And we work closely with CALSTART on this program. Thank you, Ben. This is a similar program to help reduce the upfront cost of trucks and buses, electric trucks and buses. And since we launched in about a year ago, we've seen a great deal of interest, and it seems to be accelerating. And we have made major commitments. Governor Cuomo committed to 100% electric transit bus fleets in 5 major transit agencies beside the MTA. MTA had already committed to 100% electric transit buses by 2040, and so we've now committed to that plus 5 other significant transit agencies, and we're continuing from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And I know we'll come back to some of the bus conversation following up on what Lauren shared in the earlier panel. So with next, I'll jump over to Daniel Gotti from Massachusetts. And I know Massachusetts also has a new kind of climate commitment around net zero by 2050 that the Baker administration recently put forward in their State of the Commonwealth address, and may also become law following the end of this legislative session, to be determined. But certainly that goal will require Massachusetts to be quite creative in how we get there. So Daniel, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks. You took the wind out of my introduction, but I'll run with it. Yes. Thanks everybody for hosting this. It's been a great conversation so far. So let's start with Governor Baker's commitment in January. The governor committed us to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We already had a law in Massachusetts. In fact, we've had a law since 2008 that set a mandatory emissions limit in Massachusetts that at least got us to 80%. But now we're looking at zero, net zero, but still that number zero, I think, has been a clarifying number for us at EEA. Right now, we're undergoing some very serious analysis about how we get to that number zero. It involves some extremely big decisions. Obviously, we are counting on a certain amount of offsets to be able to help us get there. But when we look at aviation, when we look at some of the challenges in the building sector, it is, as I said, clarifying as to what we're going to need to be able to achieve in transportation. In particular, as we start thinking about the medium heavy duty market, I don't have the precise numbers, and I couldn't necessarily reveal them if I could, but we're going to have to be very, very close to zero in the sector. So that's going to be a big challenge. And obviously, I want to echo the points that Adam has been making about environmental justice. I think that's a increasing priority for us as we think about our electrification programs. We're thinking about a number of initiatives right now that to try to really emphasize getting public health improvements in environmental justice communities, particularly in the wake of COVID. Heavy duty vehicles, delivery trucks, obviously that's a really critical part of being able to achieve those public health reductions. So let me just think in terms of things that we're doing right now, in addition to the role that we've played so far on this MOU. We are currently considering a new incentive program for delivery trucks. We'll have more specifics to announce on that in our next meeting of the ZEV Commission in mid-October. But we are moving forward with an incentive in that area. I think we're also going to be thinking about how we can best do kind of fleet advisory services to be able to help a lot of, particularly our smaller businesses, think through these investments. And we're looking at new programs as well to think about the infrastructure piece, and really excited to hear about some of the pieces that National Grid has been thinking about that we could build on there. And then finally, let me just say another thing that I know a lot of stakeholders are paying attention to, and we're paying a lot of attention to as well, is how we can address demand charges and the limitations that demand charges are currently playing in terms of being able to build out our infrastructure. I don't have an announcement on that quite yet, but it's an issue that we're taking very seriously, and that we look forward to continued engagement from the stakeholders in this call as we think about how to move forward cost effectively on infrastructure. So thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, Victoria, I want to kick it over to you. Obviously, under the Murphy administration, there's been a new energy master plan and a lot of thinking about how New Jersey tries to catch up on decarbonization, both on the electricity and the transportation fronts. You guys are going after both sectors at once. So I'll let you talk a little bit about the work you all are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So I work within the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. So just to give context to, when I'm speaking to some of these things, that they're certainly going to have some of that economic development slant. And I think that that's come up in what the prior members have said about making sure that we're pursuing things that can equitably address the concerns of local communities as well as industry. So seeing this as an opportunity as an economic driver, especially in recovering from the after effects of COVID and ongoing COVID pandemic, how the improvements to the transportation sector, reducing emissions in that sector, can improve health outcomes as well as hopefully, do some restart work in the economy and grow that local ecosystem around supply chain, around job training, just lots of opportunity there. So to speak directly, Ali, to the EMP, the goals within that are laid out and that the Murphy administration committed to is around 100% clean energy by 2050. And so that clean energy being defined as essentially carbon neutral generation, and also maximizing the electrification of the transportation sector and the new construction sector. So recognizing that those are two major, or actually three, if we're looking at the generation industry, the transportation industry, and the construction industry, sort of the major drivers for emissions, both greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants in the state. So within the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, my particular focus is on the RGGI funding, which Governor Murphy also brought New Jersey back into through executive order. And so through the RGGI work that we're doing in partnership with our intrastate MOU with the Board of Public Utilities and the Department of Environmental Protection, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority is responsible for that medium and heavy duty zero emissions piece of that. And so there's lots of targets tied up into this, and looking out to a target of essentially a total reduction by 80% of the greenhouse gases coming out of New Jersey by 2050. The electrification of the transportation market is critical because that represents, as in many densely populated states, a large percentage, and in fact in New Jersey, the largest percentage of our emissions. You're looking at the most densely populated state between two of the largest cities in the U.S., with the second largest port in the U.S. So there's just naturally quite a lot of traffic and transportation activity. But I do want to speak to some of the, as you've asked, these programs that we have in development. So just touching on the fact that NJEDA is working on the RGGI program. So we've just initiated that. We're trying to set up a quantitative baseline for a market study to look at what the economic impacts of growing the medium and heavy duty vehicle electrification ecosystem can look like for New Jersey, as well as projecting out and forecasting out what kind of charging infrastructure you need, what kind of emissions reductions you're looking at, how the funding structure can work for those programs. So we're considering programs like many other states, learning from our sister states in the interstate MOU on voucher programs, on training and education programs, but also casting a wide net to make sure that we're also standing behind Governor Murphy's goal to have this innovation economy in New Jersey. So looking at ways that we can innovatively spend this money to foster growth of an industry within New Jersey, to look at things that are harder to quantify, like off-road vehicles around ports and airports and farm and construction equipment, for example. So looking at ways we can use that money to pilot maybe some of these innovation projects. I do also want to touch on the fact that New Jersey this is not the first blush at this work. So there's studies done by our sister agencies. There are programs that are currently being run through VW funding, through the DEP. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that the DEP is actually leading New Jersey part of the Regional Action Plan stakeholdering. The BPU's expanding their EV proposal to include a deeper dive onto some of the medium and heavy duty vehicles, especially around public transportation. NJ Transit is expanding their bus bus adoption into electric vehicles with a target of 2032 for 100% adoption. And the Port Authority has a Class 8 truck retirement program. So there's lots of activity around this. And I guess the one thing I want to end with and hope that we can talk about a little bit more is around some of these stacked benefits, the many programs that exist within the state of New Jersey, within the US, and in our partnership between the states, that we can help to foster this growth and innovation around this topic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Victoria. And I think you gave us a lot to talk about. And I already see the questions coming in the chat, so we'll try to get to all of them. But Kay, I want to kick it over to you because Colorado recently released a clean trucking strategy. You all are the most recent state to also join Section 177 and become a low emission and zero emission vehicle. So you've joined the club with these other states. So you all have been doing a lot and are now taking that to the medium and heavy duty space. So I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Allie. We are a proud signatory of the medium and heavy duty MOU, and I think one of the deciding factors for us in signing medium and heavy duty right off the bat was some of our experience we had with light duty. We're here in the middle of the country, and we were seeing in the light duty market that we just weren't getting the vehicles, and Coloradans weren't getting the same vehicle choice that people on the coasts were. So right out of the gate, we wanted to make sure that we were part of the medium and heavy duty MOU so that, we could put that stake in the ground and signal to the truck and engine manufacturers that yes, we want to support these vehicles. Yes, we want you to bring them here. We are a pretty severe duty cycle, I think, for trucks as well with, the mountains and the weather and things like that. So really a great proving ground for some of these technologies to help them get their legs under them. So I'm happy to be part of that. I think the other aspects for us are some of the things you've heard already during this session. We, as a state, have legislation that passed in 2019. It's our House Bill 1261, which set climate goals for the state. We are developing a plan currently to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 26% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and 90% by 2050, all compared to a 2005 baseline. We know that, medium and heavy duty trucks are only about, 4% of our vehicle population, but they're responsible for about 26% of the emissions in that transportation sector. So, they're a big opportunity for us to make some good progress on our climate goals. In addition, for ozone non-attainment, our Denver Metro North Front Range area was recently downgraded from moderate to serious. And we've had a really awful ozone summer this year. And it's, pretty likely that we might get downgraded again. So again, that, dealing with the emissions from trucks is very important to us. On top of that, we know that most of these vehicles are running and most of our freight corridors are running through our low-income minority neighborhoods. And there are some pretty significant health impacts. And we want to make sure that when we do put together our medium and heavy duty strategy, that the benefits of electrification are accruing to those communities because they are bearing the brunt of the emissions and the noise and other things that are happening with medium and heavy duty trucks. I think Colorado's looking a little more broadly at the medium and heavy duty space. We've convened a stakeholder process the same day we announced the MOU. We also announced that we were kicking off a stakeholder process. We've been working really closely with the Colorado Motor Carriers Association. We've already held 2 public meetings just to kind of get people's thoughts and gather input. We know that the medium and heavy duty space is not homogenous by any stretch of the imagination. There are a lot of vehicles in this sector. They all are working vehicles. So, there are a lot of companies that depend on them to go out and get a job done every day. And we just really want to make sure that as we're making decisions, we're keeping an eye on cost and performance parity and other things, because, these aren't recreational vehicles. These are working vehicles. So as we're doing this, we're thinking about things in addition to the ZEVs themselves. We're thinking about fleet turnover. We know that 41% of our trucks aren't meeting even 2010 emissions. So thinking about ways that, we can just accelerate fleet turnover to get the vehicles, get some of the new emissions technologies onto vehicles, even in spaces where maybe the ZEVs aren't quite ready yet. We're thinking, of course, about infrastructure, in addition to, looking at key freight corridors. We're looking at highway projects as we're completing them to make sure that the facilities and the rights of way and everything are available for whatever that future charging and fueling might look like. Also making sure that warehouse projects, loading areas are ready for refrigerated units for trailers, because those are a significant source of idling. We're working with fleet partners, both big national fleets and some of the small owner operators. As folks know, the trucking market is dominated by these really small fleets, less than 6 trucks. So trying to make sure that we get all those voices in the mix, encouraging them to participate in things like EPA Smart Way, to deal with efficiency, in addition to keeping their eye on the market for ZEVs and as it's developing. We think there's some big opportunities in last mile freight delivery. We think some of those smaller medium duty vehicles that run through neighborhoods are going to be sooner to electrify than some of the big Class 8 stuff. And I think the nice co-benefit of that is that those are vehicles that folks are going to see every day. They're going to be driving through your neighborhood. People are going to experience, wow, that's a really clean, that's a really quiet vehicle. So I think there's a big public education and public experience component of that first and last mile freight moving to an electrified option. Our state fleet is also wanting to lead by example. So we're looking for opportunities within our own fleet where we can electrify. And then in addition, we're keeping our eye on some of the other signals of market readiness, making sure that our repair and maintenance technicians are trained, that our technical colleges are offering the programs that our experienced technicians and any new technicians coming into the field are going to need to be able to service the vehicles. And then we're also looking, of course, at the Advanced Clean Truck Standard and whether it makes sense for Colorado to adopt that. And we've committed to making a decision on that. We're doing some of the analysis right now. In addition to doing the public stakeholder outreach, we're also in the process of bringing on a vendor to help us with some of the technical and economic analysis that we'll need in order to bring this to our Air Quality Control Commission with a decision sometime next summer.
Fantastic, Kate. I really appreciate the holistic perspective that you guys are taking in, and I think it mirrors some of what Victoria, you shared of the number of agencies that are involved in electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles. So I'm going to pose a question that I'm trying to bundle a few questions in the interest of time, and then you all can jump in. We can popcorn. You're welcome to also respond to each other. We can just feel free to unmute yourself. The intrastate and the interstate collaboration has seemed to be really important here. All of your states have worked together in the past on, Section 177. You all are members of the U.S. Climate Alliance. You're now working together through NESCOM and the MOU. And some of that may be between your energy agencies, through your DOTs, through your, public utilities commission. So I'm just curious how you all see the role of collaboration within your states, but then also with each other in sharing best practices and programs. Some of what you mentioned, Kay, we're seeing that work around education and fleet turnover. Those are, serious priorities that are going to be needed to really make the 2030 goal achievable. So curious how you all are thinking about collaboration, and whoever unmutes first gets to answer the question. I think that's you, Daniel.
Hey, well, yeah, thanks. I hope you don't mind if I kind of fuse this with the question here that's here about incentive funding. I guess because I think that those two things are really key and interrelated, right? On one level, I think none of our states has identified anything close to the kind of incentive funding that we would need to be able to make this transition happen. And honestly, when we look at our modeling results and we look at an incentive-only kind of approach, it's super expensive. And I think that both demonstrates the need for programs like the ACT, the Advanced Clean Truck Rule, the heavy-duty equivalent of the ZEV program, and also, really underscores the need for us to be able to identify funding sources for these incentive programs, because sort of the way these things end up working, right, is that in the early years you've got a small number of total incentives that you're giving up, but if you start ramping that up to 30% sales, the impact on the budget starts being pretty overwhelming. So one thing that we're doing here in Massachusetts is that we're definitely, when we're thinking about incentive levels, we're trying to think about what is a sustainable level for us to be able to incentivize these vehicles, so that we're not just like blasting out, all of our money right now that we have, and then, having a program run out, but thinking about what is a sustainable level. But then the other thing is that we need to be thinking about, what is the dedicated source of funding for this? So we're currently working regionally with partners, including New York and New Jersey, on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a huge priority for my governor, and could be that source of dedicated funding for electrification of heavy-duty vehicles. Right now, our incentive funding is coming from RGGI, and that's not a sustainable or a long-term place to do it. But I think a key question for all of these states is, what is our plan to be able to raise the amount of money that we need to be able to make this transition happen? And, how can we get that done? Because it is going to be expensive and it's going to be challenging.
And of course, I think this blends with some of the broader recovery conversations that many of your governors are having and plan to have over the next couple of years. Adam, it looks like you unmuted and wanted to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. And there has been some great collaboration around VW settlement funds and programs to support those. With our truck voucher program, we obviously we've worked very closely with both California and there's a similar program in Chicago, and every piece of learning and best practice that we can borrow from another state is definitely one that we're going to pursue. I do want to touch on the internal interagency issues because it is really important. On transportation, there are so many different agencies within each state that touch on it in some way. In New York, obviously DOT, NYSERDA. People often don't think of us as having a role in transportation, but we clearly do when it's focused on clean energy and clean fuels and reducing emissions. Department of Environmental Conservation is managing the VW funds, and they do the regulatory approaches, like the MOU and looking at ACT. Then there's MTA and Port Authority, and you name it. It can go on. But we've developed some good collaborations and coordination around the Make Ready program, for instance, that Rachel was referring to earlier as well. That some of the medium and heavy duty approaches there piggyback on the truck voucher program and piggyback on the VW settlement funds. So we do really try to do as much integration and coordination between programs as possible.
And I wanted to add into some of the going from intra to inter as well, because I think, especially now with everyone working from home, every organization has its own priorities, every state has its own priorities, and even if they're aligned, if you're not talking, communicating regularly, it's very easy to get siloed, especially when money is tight and, you're being held to particular standards. So making sure that collaboration exists across the states and across agencies within a state is really critical. And so, one of the ways that New Jersey is looking at this is, for example, NJEDA, we've onboarded a consultant to help work through some of the technical economic analysis and some of the charging infrastructure needs. And what we're trying to make sure that we're doing is we're collaborating with all of the different agencies that are doing similar studies, so that we can, rather than everybody spending their small amount of money on repeating the same study or having to do that same baseline work, that our work, we're aligned on the metrics that we want to use, we're aligned on our goals so that our work, even if it doesn't, NJEDA is not responsible for, doing utility planning to the extent that the Board of Public Utilities is, our work can be handed off to them so that they don't have to redo the same baseline work. And similarly, interstate, how, when we're looking at modeling the charging infrastructure, for example, that, New Jersey is anticipated to need if we forecast out adoption, we're not stopping at the border of New Jersey. We're looking 10 or 20 miles out into New York and Pennsylvania, et cetera, and making sure that our states are talking, and so that we look at what's sitting on the other side of the border, and how can we integrate that into our plans, and then similarly, how can we share our data to make sure that what we're projecting as well. So I think that communication, especially when we're all working from home, is really key.
I'll echo that for sure. I mean, we don't want to use our limited resources to reinvent the wheel. And I think the beauty of the multi-state collaboration is that we can learn from each other, and we can take things that other states develop and maybe tweak them a little bit for regional conditions. But just leveraging the work of other states, I think, is huge for us. And I think that also gets to Daniel's comment about how are we going to pay for all this? And I think the conversation is especially interesting in Colorado because, we are a fiscally constrained state. We have a taxpayer's bill of rights, which requires any new tax or fee generating mechanism to be put to a vote on the ballot. So, it's challenging for us to raise the funds necessary for something really big and expensive like zero-emission vehicles, heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, and the charging infrastructure. However, I have been really encouraged by some of the conversations lately. As folks have been watching the news, I'm sure you know that we've had really severe fires this year. I-70 was impacted by one of those fires through Glenwood Canyon. The highway was closed for 2 weeks, which is just unprecedented. That's a major freight corridor. It's a major economic driver for the state. And I think increasingly we're seeing the conversation shift, not just from the cost of action, but the cost of inaction. How, it is going to be expensive, but how much more expensive is it going to be as these effects of climate change really start to snowball on us? How much more are we going to be paying the longer we wait?
I couldn't agree more, Kay, and I really appreciate you bringing that up because we know our folks all over the West Coast, in addition into the Intermountain West, are facing this head on this summer and into the fall. And Victoria, you got into this a little bit, especially sitting within the role of an economic development agency. I'm curious how you all are thinking about the co-benefits. And I know Lauren brought some of those up and Elaine brought those up in the earlier panel around public health. But I'm curious how you all are trying to quantify those, because we know, as Kay, you said articulately, was that, from a cost perspective, the costs of inaction are going to way exceed, these incentives in the upfront, and figuring out how we communicate that to the public. But then also, we've been thrilled with the private sector support for the medium heavy duty ZEV. And I think the business community gets it. And I'm curious how you all are thinking about kind of the holistic co-benefits, but then also how these public-private partnerships are going to be essential to getting this over the finish line.
Sure, and I'm happy to start. So from the economic development, perspective, we're looking at, of course, jobs potentially created, but not just, a plain count of jobs, and not just direct jobs, but also the induced jobs and indirect jobs. But looking at that across the entire value chain. So recognizing that, maybe it won't ever be cost effective to produce batteries in New Jersey because of the cost of space, but that there's opportunities for assembly or some portion of the manufacturing, that there's opportunities for maybe the software that goes behind the batteries in electric vehicles, for example. And so trying to look at this sort of grassroots opportunity, seeding education early in VOTEC schools or what have you, making sure that there's outreach into the communities, especially so the communities that are both impacted by these emissions, but also, most economically impacted as well. And so one of the strategies is that we want to talk to everybody again, not to hit too hard on the communication portion of it, but making sure that we have outreach to labor unions, that we have outreach to advocacy organizations, that we have outreach to trucking organizations, that we have outreach to the port organizations, and then also manufacturers and developers, et cetera. So making sure that we have a broad range of stakeholders to get the right input data, garbage in, garbage out. We want to get quality in and quality out. And then looking at how many jobs are produced and how is this driving the development of sort of this new industry within the state.
Sure. Let me jump in. So first of all, I think, in terms of public health and environmental justice, I think that's maybe the first thing on our minds in terms of co-benefits. And the state has an environmental justice executive order, which currently is about to become hopefully an environmental justice law any day now. That does require us to identify and target environmental justice communities. It's always a little bit complex how we do that in transportation, of course, since we're talking about mobile sources, obviously, that don't stay in one place, which can be a little bit inconvenient when you're trying to tabulate how much of an impact you're having on environmental justice communities. So, I think we're still working through the details of exactly how we're going to implement that when we think about our transportation investments, but without a question, there's going to be some kind of way of identifying environmental justice communities and making sure that they benefit. I do think that in my at least initial assessment of where these vehicles, where I'm thinking especially about the medium duty step vans, the delivery trucks, the things that we see coming on the road in the next few years. I think the majority of these emissions actually occur in environmental justice communities. The majority of these vehicles are housed in depoted in environmental justice communities. So I think it's actually going to be quite easy for us to target benefits at environmental justice communities, but we are thinking very self-consciously and intentionally about that. And then, I think in terms of the broader macroeconomic story, Massachusetts, we are at the end of the pipeline, right? We do not produce any oil. We do not have any jobs in the petrochemical industry, except for maybe the guy at the gas station. We're in a position where economically our interest is entirely reducing the amount that we spend on fossil fuels as much and as quickly as possible. And that's ultimately going to be what I think creates the majority of the jobs here in Massachusetts, is when we're spending less on imported fuel and therefore more on things that occur here and create jobs here in Massachusetts. So for us, thinking about the jobs macroeconomic impact is a really huge piece, but it really just drives us to getting these vehicles out as quickly as possible.
Great. Well, somehow we only have a minute left, so I don't know if Adam or Kay, you want to say any final words in this theme, or to answer any of the other questions in the chat or things that we had thought about, but how you all, are going to tackle this issue, and whether that's the co-benefits or also some of the complementary policies, which I know we didn't get to as much.
Go for it, Kay.
So I'll just be quick and say, I think that we're looking at the exact same co-benefits in terms of environmental justice communities, air quality, economic recovery. And I think that, if we can figure out a way to bring down that kind of initial cost for some of those small disadvantaged businesses who also use trucks, right? I think that it would be great if we can get them into the lower operating costs of zero-emission vehicles. They are much, studies and things are showing that they're much less expensive to maintain. So, if we can lower the operating costs for those companies by helping to bring down the initial cost and get them into the vehicle in the first place, I think that's a strategy we're looking at.
And I agree with what everyone else said on the co-benefits. I won't talk about that, but on the complementary policies, I think one area where I'm really excited to see the fleet assessment studies that Rachel talked about get rolled out in New York. I think that's going to be a real great benefit for fleets, because as was discussed earlier, a lot of the fleets that are buying these trucks really have no experience with it and don't know where to start and don't know how it's going to impact their operations. So I think that's a key element. Other things that we've looked at doing and have done in the past are things like buyer's guides and support with procurement for public fleets to go out and buy electric trucks and buses. Again, something that help smaller municipalities or state agencies or whoever not have to recreate the wheel, reinvent the wheel, and learn from the rest of our experiences. So those are a few things that we're definitely looking at moving forward.
Well, thank you all so much. And I'll just say, hopefully on behalf of Ceres and CalSTART, that we appreciate the opportunity to work with all of your states on this important work, and that we know you all have quite a task ahead of you in figuring out how we get there. And 2030 will be here before we know it. And as we all know, the urgency is probably even before 2030 in some of the challenges that we're seeing, in particular on the West Coast these days. So thank you all so much for taking the time, and to our other speakers earlier in the morning. And I'll just note that Ceres is thrilled to highlight, and CalSTART as well, 2 additional panels that will be later in Climate Weeks. We wanted to make sure folks had a chance to see those. My colleagues on the federal side at Ceres will be holding a session on shifting attitudes on climate change in the Republican Party, which we think is quite important as we look towards this election. And I'm excited my colleague Martha Newell-Kinsman will be hosting a session with Bob Inglis. And then I know Ben wants to tell you all about a session that CalSTART is hosting. But I'll just say a big thank you to all of you for lending your time to us this morning. And I think we'll all be working with many of you as NESCOM works to adopt these action plans, and each state works on all the complementary policies. So I imagine we'll be seeing many of you soon in other state-specific, regional, and national discussions on this topic. So thank you so much. Ben, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Ali, and thanks for moderating a terrific panel. Just very quick before we adjourn, everyone this morning, just wanted to share the next event on the CalSTART Drive to Zero calendar, which will occur at the Verge conference. As with most things held virtually these days, it'll occur on October 26th at 2:30 Eastern. It takes place for a generally West Coast audience. Now we have the opportunity to open it up somewhat. And we'll be discussing a similar theme in a slightly different context, just a tipping point for the technology of commercial zero-emission vehicles. In addition to our Executive Vice President, Bill Van Amberg, he'll be joined by Angela Holtberg, who leads the Sustainable Mobility Program for Inca Group, the parent company of IKEA, one of our core pledge partners for Drive to Zero. So we thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this important discussion this morning. We encourage you to interact with us on the social media channels listed here. Ali and I have been trying to take screen captures and tweet about this event. We'd love for you to interact with us via email, via social media. Stay engaged with our organizations as we work with NESCOM and signatory states to improve outcomes on market transformation here for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And again, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to the rest of Climate Week. Take care, everyone.